In every community, there are people who seem to embody strength, grace, and kindness. They walk through the marketplace with a soft greeting for everyone. They attend church with their heads bowed in reverence, and they present themselves as models of dignity in times of trial. Magdalena Velasco was one of those people. To anyone who didn't know her closely, she looked like a woman who had lived a life of hard luck, but still carried herself with remarkable poise. She was the kind of woman who inspired sympathy, widowed once, then again and again. By the time her 8th husband had died, people whispered not only about her misfortune, but about her strength to keep moving forward despite tragedy. Her neighbors would often say, "Poor Magdalena, fate has been cruel to her." Others would remark, "She has the strength of a saint, so much loss and yet she smiles." That smile was her shield. It was the veil she wore to hide what lived underneath, and it worked for a long time. But here's the truth that history teaches us. Appearances can be deceiving, and a smile can be the most dangerous mask of all. Magdalena had mastered the art of deception. When she buried her first husband, she wept with such convincing grief that even the priest shed tears for her. She played her role so well that nobody dared question her. After all, who would accuse a grieving widow of wrongdoing? Who would believe that a woman with such tender eyes, dressed in black and trembling at the funeral, could harbor a secret so dark? Yet behind closed doors, Magdalena was not the broken widow people thought she was. She was calculating, deliberate, and hungry for more than love. Each husband represented an opportunity, not for companionship, but for wealth, land, and control. She learned quickly that society felt sorry for widows, that the law protected them, and that sympathy could be used as a weapon. Her smile was her greatest tool. It disarmed suspicion, it gained trust, and it bought her the benefit of the doubt over and over again. Think about it. How often do we judge people by their outward appearance? How often do we decide that someone is good simply because they seem kind, polite, or sorrowful? Human beings are quick to label others based on what they see, rarely digging deeper. Magdalena knew this weakness of human nature, and she exploited it brilliantly. Every time another husband died, people comforted her. They brought food, lit candles in her home, and prayed for her soul. Meanwhile, she quietly pocketed the inheritance, sold off assets, and set her eyes on the next man. Nobody wanted to believe that such a tragedy could strike one woman so many times. Nobody wanted to see what was hiding behind her smile, but here lies the greater lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous people in our lives are the ones who hide in plain sight. They are not always loud, aggressive, or obvious. They often appear gentle, agreeable, even helpless, and that makes them harder to see, harder to confront, and much easier to trust. Magdalena's story forces us to ask a difficult question. How often do we ignore red flags because we don't want to face the truth? How often do we excuse behavior saying, "Oh, she's just unlucky," or "he wouldn't do something like that," when in reality our instincts are whispering otherwise? Her husbands had chances to see the truth. Some became mysteriously ill after meals she prepared. Some showed symptoms that doctors couldn't explain. Some even had friends who warned them about the pattern they were stepping into. But love, trust, and perhaps pride blinded them. They believed Magdalena's smile over the quiet warnings in their gut, and for that they paid with their lives. The community, too, had its share of responsibility. Neighbors whispered about curses and bad luck, but whispers never became action. Suspicion remained gossip instead of investigation. People pitied her instead of questioning her. They were so enamored by the story of the tragic widow that they refused to believe the alternative, that she wasn't cursed by fate, but driven by greed. And this is why her story matters even today. It is not just about crime, it is about awareness. It is about recognizing that sometimes the people we admire most, the people who wear the brightest smiles, may be hiding the darkest intentions. It doesn't mean we should live in paranoia or distrust everyone, but it does mean we must learn to balance compassion with discernment. There is an old saying, trust but verify. Magdalena's husbands gave their trust freely but never verified. The community gave their sympathy without question, and because of that, one woman's hidden motives destroyed 8 lives. So what do we take from this? The lesson is clear: do not let a smile blind you. Do not let sympathy silence your intuition, and do not assume that what someone shows on the outside is who they are on the inside. Appearances are temporary, behavior leaves patterns, and patterns never lie. Magdalena Velasco was a woman who hid behind a smile, but her story reminds us that masks eventually slip. Truth eventually comes to light, and when it does, it is not just the guilty who are exposed. It is also the people who ignored the signs. Her life warns us to stay vigilant, to trust wisely, and to never dismiss the quiet voice inside us that says, something is wrong here. Because sometimes the most dangerous face you'll ever meet is the one smiling back at you. In life, tragedy often feels random. A car accident, an unexpected illness, a sudden loss. These events strike like lightning, unpredictable and cruel. That is why when people saw Magdalena Velasco lose one husband after another, they thought of her life as cursed rather than suspicious. After all, what are the odds that so many men connected to one woman could all meet the same fate? To the community, it was bad luck. To Magdalena, it was her plan unfolding exactly as she intended. At first, nobody noticed the pattern. Her first husband died after a brief illness. It was sad, but not unheard of. Doctors chalked it up to infection, perhaps food poisoning. People rallied around her, whispering about how strong she was to endure such a young widowhood. Then came the second husband. Once again, illness took him swiftly. The townsfolk shook their heads and said, "This poor woman, fate is cruel." When the third husband passed, eyebrows began to rise. Still, people reasoned, some people are just unlucky. They wanted to believe it. They needed to believe it because to suggest otherwise, that Magdalena might have had a hand in these deaths, was too uncomfortable. It meant challenging their perception of her, and it meant facing the idea that evil could sit at their dinner tables, attend their church services, and walk past them smiling in the street. And so the pattern kept hiding in plain sight. But let's pause here. Isn't this the way patterns in life often work? They don't scream at us in the beginning, they whisper. They show up as small coincidences, tiny repetitions, things we brush off as chance. Only later, when we look back, do we realize the truth. Nothing was random at all. Magdalena understood this. She counted on human blindness to patterns. She knew people would rather explain her tragedies as bad luck than confront a darker reality. And with each husband who died, her confidence grew. She became bolder, smoother, more convincing. By the time she married her fourth husband, whispers had begun to stir. Can one woman really be this unfortunate? Some asked quietly. Yet still nothing was done. And why? Because people often choose comfort over truth. It was easier to pity her than to accuse her. Easier to shake their heads in sympathy than to speak out against the smiling widow. This is the danger of ignoring patterns. When we refuse to see them, we allow them to continue. Evil thrives not just because of the person committing it, but also because of the silence of those who notice but do nothing. By the time Magdalena's fifth husband fell ill, the whispers turned into suspicions. A neighbor recalled how he had often complained of sudden stomach pains after meals she cooked. A doctor noticed similarities between the illnesses of the previous husbands and this one. But still, no one stepped forward with courage. We can't accuse a widow without proof, they reasoned. She has suffered enough. And so another man was buried. This cycle continued. 6 husbands, 7 husbands, 8. By then, the pattern was undeniable. Even the most sympathetic neighbor could not explain it away. Finally, whispers reached the authorities. An investigation was launched, and when evidence of poison was uncovered, Magdalena's carefully constructed image began to collapse. The world finally saw what had been there all along. The pattern had always existed. It simply took too long for people to recognize it. Now, here's where the story becomes more than history. It becomes a mirror for our own lives. How many times have we ignored patterns in our relationships, in our choices, or in the behavior of people around us? How many times have we convinced ourselves that something was just bad luck, when deep down we saw the repetition? A friend who always borrows but never repays, a partner who always apologizes but never changes, a coworker who always manipulates but hides behind charm. These too are patterns, and like the deaths surrounding Magdalena, they are signals waiting to be recognized. The truth is this: life leaves clues. People show you who they are not once, but repeatedly. Tragedy, betrayal, even success. None of these come without patterns. The question is, are we paying attention? The community around Magdalena teaches us a painful lesson. When you ignore the whispers, the screams come later. If they had seen the pattern after the second or third husband, perhaps lives could have been saved. But because they waited, because they allowed sympathy to blind them, 8 men paid the price. And so the lesson is clear: do not dismiss patterns. Whether in your personal life, your finances, your health, or your relationships, patterns tell you the truth that words often hide. A liar will lie more than once. A cheat will cheat more than once. A manipulator will manipulate more than once. The signs will repeat until you finally see them. Magdalena Velasco's story is shocking, yes, but it is also timeless. It is a warning that patterns once ignored become prisons, and it challenges us to ask ourselves, what patterns are we overlooking today? Because here's the hard truth: most tragedies don't strike without warning. They come with small red flags, repeated signals, and subtle signs. If we learn to see them, we can protect ourselves. If we choose to ignore them, we may end up like Magdalena's husbands, believing we are safe in the arms of someone who smiles, all while standing on the edge of destruction. So the next time life whispers a pattern to you, don't wait for it to scream. Don't excuse it as bad luck. Don't hide behind denial. Pay attention. Act wisely. Protect yourself, because the pattern nobody saw coming is only ever invisible to those who refuse to look. Deception never begins with a scream. It begins with a whisper, a carefully chosen word, a small act hidden in plain sight. It doesn't arrive at your doorstep wearing a mask and chains. It comes dressed in charm, in trust, in the very things you long to believe. And once it takes root, deception spreads like a spider's web, thin, nearly invisible, yet strong enough to hold its prey until there is no way out. Magdalena Velasco spun such a web. And she spun it with patience, with calculation, with the quiet cunning of someone who knew how to make people see only what she wanted them to see. Her story wasn't one of violence in the shadows or crimes committed in rage. No, her story was far more chilling, because her greatest weapon wasn't a knife or a gun. It was deception. When her first husband died suddenly, she cried with such convincing grief that even the most suspicious onlooker believed her pain was genuine. She played her part perfectly, the broken widow the woman life had wronged. People rallied to her side, bringing food, offering comfort, whispering prayers, and as they did, her deception tightened around them. But here's the thing about deception: it grows stronger each time it goes unchallenged. When the second husband died in a remarkably similar way, she knew her neighbors were beginning to wonder. But instead of running from suspicion, she leaned into it. She appeared at his funeral draped in black, fainting with sorrow, clutching a Bible to her chest. She spoke of heaven, of loss, of faith in God's plan, and just like that, people silenced their doubts. They couldn't imagine that someone so soft-spoken, so gentle, so full of apparent faith could be capable of cruelty. This is how deception works. It takes what people want to believe and feeds it back to them. By the time her third and fourth husbands died, her web had stretched wide. Neighbors pitied her, the church prayed for her. Even the doctors, puzzled by the repeated illnesses, comforted her with gentle words instead of sharp questions. Each strand of her web was reinforced by their silence, their sympathy, their unwillingness to confront the uncomfortable truth, and make no mistake, that truth was uncomfortable. To suggest that Magdalena was behind these deaths meant facing the idea that evil could sit at the table with you, hold your hand in prayer, and smile while burying her secrets beneath the soil of fresh graves. But here is what makes the web of deception so dangerous. It doesn't just trap the guilty, it traps the innocent too. Her husbands trusted her, her neighbors defended her. Even her closest friends refused to see what was in front of them. Everyone was caught, bound by threads of lies too delicate to notice until it was too late. Eventually, though, webs glisten when the light hits them. The pattern of deaths became too blatant to ignore. Doctors began whispering about poison. Neighbors recalled odd remarks she had made, or how her husbands often grew sick after her meals. The authorities, pressured by whispers that could no longer be silenced, finally launched an investigation. And when they did, the web began to unravel, evidence of poison surfaced, inconsistencies in her stories piled up. Her mask of grief, once so convincing, began to crack. The widow's tears dried up under questioning. The town that had pitied her realized they had been living inside her web all along. Now here's where this story transcends history and speaks directly to us. How many of us have been caught in webs of deception in our own lives? They don't always come in the form of murderers or criminals. Sometimes they come as a friend who lies to us, a partner who manipulates us, a leader who promises what they never intend to deliver. The strands of those webs are made of half-truths, excuses, apologies, and charm. And just like Magdalena's neighbors, we often choose to ignore them. We tell ourselves it's just bad luck. It's just coincidence. They didn't mean it. We rationalize, we defend, we excuse, all while the web grows stronger, harder to escape. But here's the truth. Deception can only survive where denial exists. Every time someone looked away from Magdalena's pattern, every time they chose sympathy over suspicion, they gave her web more power. It is the same in our lives. When we ignore the lies of others, when we refuse to confront manipulation, when we silence our instincts, we too become trapped. The lesson is simple, but it is hard. Trust, but verify. Love, but with wisdom. And when you see a pattern of lies, don't explain it away. Don't let charm blind you. Don't let pity silence you. A spider's web looks delicate, but it is designed to destroy anything that touches it. Magdalena Velasco's story is chilling, yes, but it is also revealing. It reminds us that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it smiles in broad daylight. And it doesn't always trap us with force. Sometimes it lures us in with kindness, sympathy, and trust. So I ask you, what webs might you be entangled in right now? What lies have you accepted because it was easier than facing the truth? What patterns have you ignored because they were too uncomfortable to confront? Don't wait until the web tightens around you. Don't wait until you're too bound to escape. Open your eyes now. Look closer. See the threads for what they are, because deception is only powerful when you refuse to see it. Once exposed, once torn apart by truth, the web collapses, and the deceiver, no matter how skilled, is left standing naked in the light of reality. Remember this, the strongest protection against deception is awareness. The more you see, the less you can be trapped. The more you confront, the less power deception has over you. Magdalena Velasco spun her web to perfection. But the day came when even her lies could not hold. And in that moment, the world saw her not as a widow, not as a victim, but as the predator she truly was. In the small town where Magdalena Velasco lived, whispers always traveled faster than the wind. People noticed things. They noticed how her husband seemed to wither like crops in a drought, how each funeral followed the same pattern. Tears, veils, and the faintest smile on Magdalena's lips that didn't match her sorrowful attire. At first, no one dared to speak their suspicions aloud. After all, grief could twist faces in strange ways. But when her 8th husband was lowered into the ground, the truth could no longer remain hidden. The local priest had been the first to admit what everyone else feared to say. This cannot be coincidence. His words stirred something in the community. 8 husbands gone in the span of 20 years. Each of them healthy men before their marriage, each of them meeting strangely similar ends. Unexplained fevers, sudden collapses, and stomach pains that seemed to burn them alive. The pieces of the puzzle had been there all along, scattered across time, but now they came together to form a picture no one could ignore. Magdalena had crafted an image of herself as a woman of elegance, faith, and unshakable dignity. She was always at church, always the first to lend a hand to her neighbors. People believed she was unlucky in love, cursed even, and for years they pitied her. But the truth is that she had been hiding behind the veil of respectability, using her charm as a mask for something far darker. When investigators finally opened the graves of her husbands, they found traces of poison in their remains, subtle but undeniable. Arsenic, the silent killer, had been the weapon in her hands. The truth was shocking not because it was complicated, but because it was so simple. A smile, a cup of wine, a bowl of stew, these had been her tools. and behind them lay a hunger for control, for wealth, or perhaps even the thrill of watching life fade from those who trusted her most. What made the truth unbearable for the town was not just that Magdalena had taken lives, but that she had done it with such calculation and for so long. Neighbors realized they had sat with her at dinner tables, hugged her at weddings, and prayed beside her in church pews while men were dying slowly under her roof. The deception cut deep because it showed how blind people can be when they choose to ignore the signs right in front of them. And yet, when the truth came to light, it carried a lesson. Secrets can be hidden for a time, but not forever. Evil can wear the mask of kindness, but eventually the mask slips. The truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. Magdalena's crimes might have gone undetected for years, but in the end, justice caught up with her. She was arrested, tried, and exposed for what she truly was: a murderer hiding behind a widow's veil. For the townspeople, this revelation forced them to reflect on their own lives. How many times had they ignored the unease in their hearts because it was easier to believe in the goodness of a smile? How many times had they excused away the coincidences because they didn't want to face the discomfort of suspicion? Magdalena's story was a tragedy, yes, but it was also a warning. Don't let appearances blind you to reality. Don't assume the truth can be silenced forever. Her trial was a turning point in the community. People became more cautious, more discerning. They began to ask harder questions, to trust their instincts, to speak when something didn't feel right. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of Magdalena Velasco's life. The reminder that silence and complacency allow deception to thrive, but truth, once spoken, has the power to break chains and open eyes. The truth that couldn't stay buried was not only about 8 dead husbands, it was about human nature itself. It was about the tendency to overlook the obvious when it's uncomfortable. It was about the cost of turning away from warning signs. Magdalena's smile may have fooled many, but in the end her deeds shouted louder than her mask of charm. So, what should we take from her story? That lies can never outlast the truth, that secrets always have a way of surfacing, and that we too must guard ourselves, not just from people like Magdalena, but from the temptation to close our eyes to things we don't want to see. Her life may have ended in shame, and her name may forever be etched into infamy, but the legacy of her crimes leaves us with a message worth remembering. No matter how long it takes, the truth will rise. And when it does, it demands that we learn from it. When Magdalena Velasco was finally brought before the court, the entire nation turned its eyes toward the small town that had once pitied her as a grieving widow. Newspapers splashed her face across front pages, painting her as both a monster and a mystery. How could one woman have buried 8 husbands under the cloak of respectability without suspicion falling upon her sooner? That was the question gripping the public, and it was the question the court now had to answer. The courthouse overflowed with spectators. Journalists traveled miles to witness what they dubbed the widow's trial. People stood shoulder to shoulder, eager for every detail, every tear, every testimony, every whispered accusation. To some, Magdalena was already guilty in their eyes, a cold-blooded killer who had betrayed the very vows of marriage. To others, she remained a tragic figure, perhaps cursed, perhaps simply the victim of cruel coincidence. But as the proceedings unfolded, doubt began to fade. The prosecution presented its case with devastating precision. Medical experts testified that the exhumed remains of her husbands revealed traces of arsenic, levels consistent with slow, deliberate poisoning. One by one, neighbors recounted eerie details: how each husband fell ill soon after marriage, how Magdalena nursed them with unwavering devotion, and how she always seemed to emerge wealthier after each death. But what struck the jury most was the pattern. 8 men, 8 nearly identical fates. Coincidence no longer seemed plausible. A single tragedy could be chance, 2 could be misfortune, but 8, that was intention. The defense, however, painted a different portrait. They argued that Magdalena was a misunderstood woman, unfairly judged because of her past. They insisted the evidence was circumstantial, that arsenic was once common in household products and could have contaminated the remains without her hand in it. They leaned heavily on her character, her faith, her community service, her charitable works, as proof she could not have committed such atrocities. And yet, as Magdalena sat silently in the courtroom, her composure raised even more questions. She did not weep, did not tremble, did not show the grief or indignation one might expect from the falsely accused. Instead, she carried herself with the same dignity she had worn at each funeral, her face unreadable, her smile faint but present, as though she knew something the rest of the world did not. Outside the courthouse, the nation was divided. Some saw her as the embodiment of evil, a woman who had twisted love into a weapon and used marriage as a path to murder. Others whispered that perhaps her husbands had been cruel behind closed doors and that Magdalena had taken justice into her own hands. The uncertainty made the trial not only about guilt or innocence, but about how society viewed women, power, and morality. Each headline fanned the flames of public debate. Was Magdalena a predator who had used her charm to mask her crimes, or was she a victim of a society too eager to demonize a strong woman? The courtroom became more than a stage for justice. It became a mirror reflecting the fears, prejudices, and curiosities of an entire nation. As the trial dragged on, the evidence grew impossible to ignore. Bank records revealed that Magdalena had inherited large sums from each husband, money she used to expand her estate and maintain her polished reputation. Servants testified that they had seen her mixing strange powders into food and drink, and though she denied everything, her calm demeanor worked against her. It was as though her lack of emotion betrayed a chilling truth. This was not a woman mourning the accusation against her. This was a woman who had long grown accustomed to death. When the verdict was finally read, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Guilty, the word hung in the air like a tolling bell. Some gasped, others wept, and still others nodded solemnly as though they had expected nothing less. Magdalena herself remained motionless, her face unchanging, her lips pressed into the same faint smile she had worn from the beginning. But the trial did not end with her sentencing. Its ripple effects spread across the nation. Communities began to talk more openly about deception, about the danger of ignoring warning signs in relationships, about the human tendency to trust appearances even when the truth whispers otherwise. For women, her story became both a caution and a tragedy, proof of how power could corrupt, but also a reminder of how quickly society could turn from sympathy to suspicion. For men, it was a warning that even trust within the home could be betrayed if vigilance was abandoned. The nation learned something deeper from the trial, that evil does not always come with a snarl or a shadow. Sometimes it comes dressed in silk, veiled in smiles, and spoken in gentle tones. Magdalena Velasco was not just a woman who poisoned 8 men. She was a symbol of how long lies can endure when people choose comfort over truth. In the years that followed, her name became synonymous with betrayal. Plays, novels, and cautionary tales were spun from her life. Parents told their children not to be fooled by appearances. Pastors preached sermons about hidden sins, and journalists cited her case whenever a scandal rocked the nation. The trial had not only exposed a murderer, it had forced a society to confront its own blindness, its willingness to bury suspicions rather than face uncomfortable truths. Magdalena Velasco may have tried to bury her crimes with her husbands, but in the end, it was the truth that could not stay buried. And when it surfaced, it shook not just a courtroom, not just a town, but an entire nation.